Yeah, in the student work room. It's an extra stop. I gotta make it. I'm just making excuses. I should just back.
Now that said, I'm like,
but also like I'm saving myself that much. I don't think it's actually so much more time.
I think I find it seems. I mean, I'm gonna try that.
That's like that.
7 or 8 sessions. No, I sent them to my son's
Haley and I are both out. We haven't really started either. They don't know. Well, yeah, like I feel like we got a lot of. This time we're just like. Good luck. We haven't. We don't even have one.
No, that's just good.
Yeah. Like we do for the book itself within so many weeks now that like having the formatting instructions is just not. Yeah, it's all in A-Raps document.
Well, he's fighting the tide. Like that.
As also like master setting guidelines for. Just like more questions. I think like the professor. Yeah.
I don't know.
That's all you really. Particularly in math. Maybe it's also just like I really struggle to get I'm engaged.
I have learned.
It's okay if you do. I don't. Just like be a person. Because it makes it so unapproachable. I don't feel like I can ask you a question because I don't know the answer. Yeah. He does use Socratic in a way that a lot of professors use it.
Oh, that's what that chat was.
I do. Maybe I'm just mad about the reading so draining. We read about it. This could have been it. For many months it was just a page. Yeah, I also doesn't. Also because he's nice, so I'm like not like afraid of him. But I'm afraid of this is not like because I think I'll be being afraid because like it's like his exchange. He's like 12 steps ahead. He like has counter examples like so quickly to like.
So you conduct things. I'll come in later.
Great. Let us go ahead and get started. Welcome to the second class of, we're getting a bit of a rebound here. Let me push this down. Welcome to the second class of Conduct of Life, where we will be discussing the academic form of philosophy as it has taken hold in the Anglo-American world. We will discuss how and why that vision has taken hold, its larger implications, not just for philosophy, but as we will see, for many common conceptions that are made now about agency in the world we're living in. And then we will go on to discuss other possible approaches, most significantly the ones we will be attempting in this class, which will be going in a very different direction. So to set this up, let me say a few words about our readings for today, about that project, using that to jump into the larger world of Anglo-American philosophy as it currently is constituted, and then move on to the critique. So our readings for today are, of course, from Derek Parfit, a small excerpt of a 3-volume work, On What Matters is what it's called, where Derek Parfit attempted to bring together a final solution to all, he thought, of the moral and ethical problems of humanity. His mode of doing so was to argue, and this first point is certainly true enough, that in the world of Anglo-American analytic philosophy, there were, and still are, 3 major traditions. We will discuss each of them in turn very, very briefly to give you a sense of what they are. And Parfit's argument was, if we can show that, in fact, these 3 positions, supporters of which are dramatically arguing against each other, if we can show that the 3 traditions are, if reworked carefully enough, really getting at the same point, then we will be, and I'll just use his analogy here because it's so telling, understanding that, in fact, these 3 radically different approaches are like 3 different ways of climbing the same mountain, and if we bring them together, we will be at the top of the mountain with a single position that, of course, will be the correct position, because if it in fact answers all of the concerns of all 3, it will prove that each of them was actually right and, in fact, not in contradiction to the others, and therefore we will have solved the moral and ethical problems of humanity. Now, if that sounds a bit problematic, we'll get to the many, many problems of this. But first, let me very briefly lay out the 3 positions, just because it'll be helpful to have some terminology on the table for our later discussion. So the 3 positions, and I'll just introduce them here in the order that he gives them in this excerpt. The first one is deontological ethics, which he will simply call Kantianism, because the primary figure in question here is, in fact, Immanuel Kant. So as he correctly notes, Immanuel Kant's move here in the little bit of a little tiny piece of Immanuel Kant that is being used for this argument, Immanuel Kant argues that I should never act in any way that I could not make my actions into a universal law for all humans. I therefore should never, under any circumstances, treat another human being as a means, but only as an end in themselves. So, to give an example that Parfit himself alludes to, and it's a very famous one because Kant himself gives it, there's the infamous murderer at the door example that Kant gives. Actually, in fact, it was a critique of Kant that Kant was responding to, but he does hold to his principles here. So here is the story to give you a sense of what this would mean in practice. So you're sitting at home and someone knocks on the door and says, I'm an innocent person and there's a murderer who's trying to kill me. Can I hide in your house? And you would plausibly say, yes, hide in my house because you're innocent and the murderer is going to try to kill you. He then hides in your house and then the murderer knocks on your door. And the murderer says, okay, well, is that innocent person that I want to murder hiding in your house? And the question is, can you lie to the murderer to save the innocent person or not? And Kant's answer is, well, no, I cannot universalize lying, and I should not treat a human being as a means, but only as an end, and I cannot be concerned with the consequences of my action. I must only do what is right, and therefore I must tell the truth. And then he says, now hopefully while I'm telling the truth, the innocent person will sneak out the back window, and so he'll survive. And the reason he says this is to say, well, no, as soon as I get into the world of considering consequences to my actions, it means I can suddenly start justifying almost anything because, in human life, rarely will it be the case that there will literally be an innocent person that you're protecting from a clear murderer. And so once you get into the murkiness of everyday life, you could end up justifying anything. So therefore, you must not, in this example, ever lie or, again, at a larger level, ever do anything that could not be made into a universalizable principle. The second position is called consequentialism, which, as the name implies, is concerned explicitly with what Kant says we should not ever be concerned with, which is the consequences of our actions. The by far most significant consequentialist position, and accordingly the one that Parfit will give most of his attention to, is utilitarianism. Utilitarianism, the basic position is that you are concerned with the consequences of your actions such that the consequences will bring about more good than harm. In other words, that the benefits will outweigh the harms for any action you take. Now, as Parfit correctly notes, that phrasing is in terms of a specific act. By far the much more common utilitarian position, and the one Parfit therefore accordingly will devote most of his attention to, is rule utilitarianism. So it's not just my immediate actions, it's as a rule, how should I act in a way that will give the most benefit to the most people with, therefore, the least amount of harm with that benefit being given? And how do I evaluate and weigh the consequences such that more benefit is being created than harm that is being created? Going very quickly to the next one before we put these together, as Parfit will try to. The final position is called social contractarian positions, which basically says the action that should be taken in any kind of an ethical decision should be that which rational individuals can recognize out of self-interest as being the best possible solution. So, unlike the Kantian position, you can explicitly deal with consequences, but unlike the consequentialist position, how would you evaluate this, and do you try to come up with some kind of quantitative measure of cost-benefit? From the social contract position, the answer is no, it's what self-interested individuals would decide amongst themselves would be the best outcome. Please. Yes, we will come back to that. So the question, if you couldn't hear, where does virtue ethics come into this? Let me quickly go through Parfit's analysis and then we'll return to virtue ethics because indeed, virtue ethics arose in the 20th century as a revival of Aristotelian thinking explicitly as a critique of these. So for that reason, we will come back to it later when we're getting to our critique, but we will indeed get to this. Great question. Now, Parfit's move, getting back to these three, is to argue that all of these, in fact, amount to the same thing if you give the key tweaks to each of them. And to give a sense of how he is going to do this, let me give a typical example that is often given in these debates to give a sense of how it works, but also to give concretely to help you understand the moves Parfit is making. So a very typical way these issues are debated is to create these insanely artificial situations in which you're asked to decide which of these three positions will give you the proper answer. So there's the famous trolley car example where there's a trolley car that's about to hit a wall, a bunch of people will die. You can save them, but only if you push one person who's on the bridge with you over. So you'll kill one person but save a bunch of people. So what do? Can you treat the person as a means to save the others, or do you not do that because you can't kill anyone, etc. Another very common one is the lifeboat example. So you're on a shipwreck, you're stuck on a lifeboat in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean, there are 4 of you, there's exactly enough food for 3 people, what do? And of course the consequentialist argument would be, well, it's in the benefit of people that 3 people live as opposed to endangering all 4. So you toss someone off and then you do a calculation of which one gets tossed off. The social contractual position would in all likelihood amount to the same thing, that self-interested individuals would come to the same solution, but then the question is, what would be the criteria by which we decide who gets tossed off? If it's a president of a country, does position matter more? If there's a child, does age matter more? That person has lived less life, so they should be allowed to live. So how do we decide who to toss off? And of course, the Kantian position is, no, you can't toss anyone off. That's a concern with consequences. You cannot ever kill anyone, and you just hope the ship will rescue you before you run out of the food for 3 people. So note what is going on in this example. And I use this to get back to Parfit. So in an example like this, you intentionally create an artificial scenario that by definition no one would ever actually face. You take out of consideration any of the complexities of life. You create an artificial set of possible answers that, again, one of these 3 will give you the possible solution to. And perhaps most importantly in the artificial scenario, you are not allowed to question any of the assumptions behind the exercise. Should we, for example, think of people as rational, self-interested individuals who are making moral decisions? Note the number of assumptions that are required to map a human being that way. That's taken out of the equation. What about larger socioeconomic issues? By definition, they're not even part of the discussion. All of the key questions, in other words, about what makes us human, about our lives, the social world we're living in and helping to construct for better or for worse, are taken out of the exercise. And once it's taken out, you're not allowed to question any of the assumptions, and then you simply make moves within that set of incredibly delimited assumptions. And the moves you're making within those delimited sets of assumptions are simply procedural. You're simply asking, how would these 4 people come to a solution in this ridiculously artificial situation? I, perhaps a little bit meanly, use that to return to Derek Parfit's work. This is kind of the way Parfit's entire book operates. Again, it's a 3-volume book. You've only read an excerpt, but you've gotten a very telling sense of how he does this. So he is not questioning any of these assumptions. He is not asking, should we think of human beings as rational, self-interested individuals? Why should we think that? What are the implications of defining human beings that way? Should we think of morality in terms of specific decisions in this one absurdly artificial situation? All of that is cut out from the discussion, and rather he takes each of these simply as specific procedural moves in terms of how you would negotiate a decision among rational, self-interested individuals. Once he does that, the solution is, and I won't take you through the details, but just very, very briefly, the basic move is to say, he begins with the Kantian position and says, okay, yes, that's right, but if we realize that you actually have to be concerned with universalizability within situations, in other words, you tweak it to say, I cannot act in a situation in a way that would not be universalizable for that situation. That, of course, becomes the key by which he can then say, and then once we're in the situation, how would we evaluate what norms and criteria would be proper and universalizable in that situation? And of course, once he's there, then he can easily say, well, then you have to be concerned with things like consequences. But of course, once you're concerned with things like consequences, how do you determine what consequences to weigh in what way? Well, at some point, you have to bring in self-interested individuals who can adjudicate that, which gets you into social contractual positions. And the result of this is, once it's all put together, again, and we finish the full 3 volumes, you're on top of the hill and all possible questions of moral philosophy have been solved. Needless to say, I am putting it a little meanly, but I think not terribly unfairly, needless to say, the concern here would be, among many others, isn't the lesson of this book the precise opposite of the one that he wants to claim it to be? If, after these 3 volumes, he has really solved all problems, doesn't it rather just show that, in fact, if you take three positions that basically share the exact same set of assumptions, namely that we are rational, self-interested individuals who, if we put them in positions where we're not allowed to question that assumption or any other assumption, we can come up with a single, very coherent explanation of what they should normatively be doing. Not doing, but procedurally how they would decide amongst themselves what they should properly do, which would show how incredibly, one might think, limiting this entire approach is. On that point, let me now move out to a slightly larger point to get to the ultimate implications of this exercise. Among the many dangers of this, the first one being the one we've pointed out, that the entire approach cuts out from discussion what should be, one would think, the larger questions that any discussion of human morality, human activity in the world should be involved with. Values, the implications of defining human beings one way versus another way, the entire social world we construct by the way we define human beings. Even the word decision is very fraught. I mean, what are the implications of thinking of these things as decisions? All of this, by being cut out, is part of a larger project. To make this point, let me say a few more words about the thinkers from which these three positions are being taken. I've already mentioned briefly Kant's entire argument that forms the basis of Parfit's discussion. This is taken from one little piece of Kant. Kant was a pretty radical thinker, agree with him or not, but he was trying to radically rethink the entire history of Western philosophy, radically rethink the socio-political worlds that he was involved in, radically rethink ethical decision-making in a far more radical way than you would get from this murder at the door example that Parfit focuses on, which again was Kant's example, but he's answering a critic when he says this. All of this is taken out. Where does social contractarian theories come from? These are 17th and 18th century European philosophers, Hobbes, Locke, and Rousseau being the three major ones, major attempts to rethink the entire world they were living in, all of which is cut out. And what about utilitarianism? This is a huge movement. The most significant figure by far is Jeremy Bentham. A little bit later, he's moving into the early 19th century, trying to come up with a radical rethinking of the socio-political order. Let me now say a few more words about that socio-political vision, because it will be very telling about what's happening in the academic philosophy that we're looking at today. And here I will reverse the order or shift them slightly to go on a more chronological basis. So, Hobbes, Rousseau, Locke, when they were developing theories of the social contract, what are they trying to do? So the move here is basically to say, we live in a world where all positions of power are defined pretty much exclusively by birth. They are beginning to see what we now would say, in retrospect, are the precursors of a market economy. They are calling for a revisioning of the social world in which everything would be defined by sovereign individuals who are rational and who decide amongst themselves what they will decide as being theirs, that they are sovereign over. In other words, what is their sovereign property, and how to make a livable world. Will they make agreements for what they will give up of their property to give a social contract that would be workable with other sovereign individuals? So, if I'm going to give up some of my property for taxes and welfare will be an example we'll get to with utilitarianism, but for whatever reason to make a workable social world, I will, but I do that as a sovereign, self-interested individual. When Kant comes in a little bit later, Kant's move here is to say, yes, fine and good about social contract theories, but the danger is, and this is what Kant cares most about, is I want a world in which every individual will be self-legislating. So every individual would be, in a sense, a god, but a god not who just can do whatever the god wants to do, a god who will have universal principles, but that as a rational individual that God chooses to accept. In other words, I will accept limitations to my actions because they are universalizable. Quickly moving to utilitarianism, slightly later, Bentham's move here is to say, again, fine and good. He's actually not dramatically disagreeing with these, but what he wants to bring to the equation is to say, okay, but we still have larger issues, or he would say larger issues, of inequality in any given society that's been developed either in the social contractarian way or in the Kantian way, and I want a rule-based calculus by which we could do things like, for example, welfare and redistribution such that we would be concerned with overall benefit for larger numbers of people than would ever be possible in simply a social contractarian way or in a Kantian way. Adding these three together, what do you get? Well, liberalism. What we're really talking about here is the development of liberal socio-political theory. Liberal, I mean in the classical sense, not liberal in the sense of liberal versus conservative in contemporary America. I mean classical liberal thinking. Classical liberal thinking, which is focused on sovereign individuals defined as self-interested figures who decide amongst themselves how to properly govern themselves with a constitution, who allocate resources through a marketplace, who will develop rational bureaucracies to do further allocation in terms of welfare, etc., based upon strictly utilitarian means. Putting this broadly, this is kind of the world that we live in. And note immediately the degree to which in the world we live in, we kind of fall into exactly the things that I just mentioned Parfit is falling into as well in the much more rarefied world of Anglo-American academic philosophy. In other words, when you work through all of liberal political theory, the world we're largely living in, note it operates the same way by having such an incredibly delimited definition of humans, rational individuals, radically focusing in terms of value questions, not on the values, but procedural ways of adjudicating conflicting claims amongst sovereign individuals. Once you're at that level, you cut out almost all of the grand, larger questions that we could be posing. Well, number one, and most obviously, is this right? Like, should we be thinking of human beings as rational self-agents? What are the implications of that delimited definition? Note, once you get into this system, that's not what you're questioning. Rather, the debate, when it's working from the point of view of liberal theory, yeah, I'll get to it in just a moment, from the point of view of liberal theory is the procedural way that decisions are being made, but the procedures predefine the level of and depth of the possible questioning. So, how do you rethink the socioeconomic world we're in? Well, to give America as the extreme example, you rethink it by creating a set of procedural definitions in which you have interest groups forming. You have defined the political process in which those interest groups vie for power, along with vying for power within an economic market as well. And getting back to the political decisions, those political decisions therefore come down to things like, well, do we tax the uber wealthy at 34% or 32%, to give the examples of the two positions that are actually plausibly implementable in the current American political system, which, needless to say, is a radical delimitation of the possible sets of questions that could be asked. That, in essence, is how the entire system tends to operate. And I emphasize this to say, when I mentioned before that there is a danger by the entire ways that Anglo-American philosophy will pose questions, in other words, by creating these artificial scenarios, asking the big questions in terms of procedures that presume certain assumptions about the world and about the nature of human beings and the nature of decision making. Once you are there, it takes out the big questions, and I would here like to point out there's a bigger danger too. The more we play these mind games in these ways, the more it might dangerously train us to do the same in our everyday lives, where we are becoming very good, and I don't mean this in a positive sense, at not asking ourselves what is really going on in the world and what are our values, we end up just largely accepting a world because we're in a world that kind of operates precisely by doing this. If this is the case, let me use that to jump in very briefly to the larger themes of this class. If all three of these positions are basically 17th, 18th, early 19th century positions, just being picked up in the world of Anglo-American philosophy and in a very specified sense, if that is the case, a few points are sort of obvious from that fact, but bear pointing out. These so-called great philosophical positions that if unified would solve all problems, a little odd that all happen to arise in one little geographical area of the world, namely Europe, at one particular moment, and somehow those three positions would somehow solve all possible problems. Even if we knew nothing about these positions, had not had the discussion we just had, on the face of it, that would be absurd. And that raises a larger question too. Even these moves, note immediately, are arising, again, geographically at a certain, in one tiny piece of the globe. They're happening temporally at a very restricted moment too. This is a moment when you are getting people attempting to take Protestant understandings of the self, secularize them, and coming up with a secular understanding of human beings within the emergence of a market economy. We happen to be inheritors of that world, which is why so much of this seems natural to us, rational individuals, blah, 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 but that's just because we've come to take it for granted. This is not only one position from one part of the globe, even within that one part of the globe, namely Europe, it's a pretty restricted position. To begin with the obvious examples, looking at Christianity, is this the only way to develop a secularized vision of Christian concepts? Or putting it more pointedly, are there not many other things that could be built upon from the Christian tradition, far more dramatic and far more exciting than simply taking the privatized Protestant individual, secularizing that, and then creating this world of sort of devalued in which everything comes down to procedures? By posing it that way, I'm obviously implying no. There is so much more from the Christian tradition that could be built upon, and we will be looking later in this class at other examples. Emerson is taking a radically different approach than any of the liberal political theorists we've been looking at, and agree with Emerson or not, it raises intriguing questions for liberal political theory. Not to say one is right or one is wrong, but it's building on very different elements of the Christian tradition. And if we're not fully satisfied with Emerson, again, the question will always be, and then what else can we do? What do we do with liberal political theory? What do we do with Emerson? And of course, we won't be stopping at Christianity in this course. What about the rest of the world? To give examples we will be discussing, what about Buddhism? What about Confucianism? What conceptions of the self do you see developing in these traditions? What would it mean to rethink these traditions in the current world? And would that open up yet more possibilities? We will, of course, answer strongly, yes. And if we had more than 11 more weeks to go, we could obviously do a lot more than just Buddhism and Confucianism, meaning we hope you will continue this exercise saying the following. If Parfit is right, that all three of these positions amount to the same thing, if that's a convincing position, perhaps it's convincing because the positions are so delimiting that it shows the incredible limited nature of the entire exercise. And what if, on the contrary, we focus not on these meta-ethical procedural questions, but actually try to question the assumptions themselves? Rational self-interested rational individuals. What are the implications of that? What are other ways of thinking about human beings? What other values can be brought into play? And to open up these possibilities, what happens if we build upon and take seriously great traditions from throughout the world, and what new possibilities does that open up? And needless to say, wherever this will take us, it will not be simply one mountain with only three paths that will take us to the final solution. It will rather be a world, and a very complex, difficult, painful world of possibilities, but in that difficult, painful world, those possibilities could be dramatically opening in precisely the way I think a Parfit approach is in danger of closing off. And with that, should we open for a few questions? Oh, and yes, and first let me actually first get your previous question about virtue ethics. So yes, the question was about virtue ethics, and let me indeed say a few words about this. So virtue ethics actually begins in the Western tradition with Aristotle. So Aristotle's basic move is to say what we should be thinking of in terms of morality is humans developing good habits to lead a virtuous life. So you're not worried about in this specific moment, what is procedurally the way to decide what to do. You're saying, how would we train ourselves to be virtuous in any possible situation? That's developed again by Aristotle, and Elizabeth Anscombe earlier in the 20th century did exactly what we're talking about in this class, took this Aristotelian idea and said, what happens if we bring this into the 20th century? And she said this quite explicitly, and use it to critique the three positions that we have been talking about, and she wanted to bring this into conversation. Now, the reason we're not discussing it explicitly here is because we will later, when we get to Confucianism, be talking about a different form of virtue ethics, not quite Aristotelian, in some ways I think even more sort of radical in its implications, but we will be getting to this. Nonetheless, let me say a few words about the position. Unfortunately, part of what has happened with virtue ethics is something like what we've seen with these three positions. It too has tended to become domesticated, such that it becomes part and parcel of the same thing. So if I'm trained properly and educated properly to be able to do the kind of adjudications we are talking about, that would be a key part of being able to live up to the requirements of the school of philosophies. In other words, it has tended to become domesticated into becoming, or I'll put it more strongly, how could I become the kind of individual who could make these decisions? And I would say very strongly, I think Elizabeth Anscombe was trying to get at something much more radical than simply how do we educate ourselves to be good, rational, self-interested individuals. In fact, Elizabeth explicitly opposed that position. Certainly Aristotle was not saying this. Certainly, as we will see later, Confucianism also does not. So getting back to the heart of the question, when we get to virtue ethics a bit later in the class via Confucianism, we will indeed be presenting it in a way that to say, yes, this would be if presented in its most powerful form, is and should be a fundamental challenge to these delimited ways of thinking. So great question. And I think you had a second question too. Yes, please. Please.
The caricature of Western philosophy
Yes.
as being what you're criticizing here.
Yes.
Really, you're talking about like one subdivision.
Oh, yes.
Of the subdivision of the subdivision.
Precisely.
Analytic philosophy. So
Yes.
you leave this class with the idea that this is all Western philosophy is
Oh.
trying to do.
No, he's talking about
No, I'm sorry if I gave that impression, the exact opposite.
the current academic form of moral philosophy,
Yes.
especially in the Anglo-American world. That's what he's talking about.
Yeah, and let me, just to be sure I wasn't unclear, let me strongly emphasize this. My point would actually be what I think you're trying to get at in your question, to say, no, I think this particular form is a radical delimitation of, on the contrary, not just of all of Western philosophy, but even of the significant figures that led to these three positions. So when you're reading Parfit, you're thinking, is this all there is to Kant? No. Is this all there is to social contractarian theory? No. Is this all there is to utilitarian theory? No. So when you, just to stick with those examples, if you read Kant, Locke, Rousseau, and Hobbes for social contractarian theory, Bentham for utilitarianism, it's a far more dramatic and radical set of thinkers than you would get a sense from here, and those are only 5 thinkers of the Western tradition. So yes, many apologies that came out of it. I was implying that this represents Western philosophy. Not at all. It's a delimitation of the power, and one of our hopes when we beginning next week, get to Christianity is to say what has been lost with that delimitation and what in the tradition, on the contrary, can be given in its most powerful form. So yeah, thank you for the clarification, or the allowing for the clarification. Thank you.
So I will begin
Yes,
where
please.
you began, Michael, and then take a few steps further. So we're discussing the Parfit thesis and the conventional form of academic moral philosophy, the most conventional form, not the only form, especially in the Anglo-American Academy. so that we have a contrast to the approach to ethics that we're undertaking in this course. And in the Anglo-American Academy, moral philosophy is in large part, has become in large part, the study of three schools. The consequentialist or Benthamite school, the deontological or Kantian, and the social contract view, which invokes the name of Jean-Jacques Rousseau as its major figure. Now, the first thing to say is that these great philosophers should not be blamed for this academic construction. And their names are taken in vain. All of them were concerned with the path of our ascent to a higher form of life, as individuals and collectively the human race. And all of them situated their moral views in the context of a vision of our place in the world. When we discussed before in a previous class this issue, I'd like to remember a remark of Bentham's, not in any of his major writings, but in a dedication that he wrote to a book that he gave to a lady in London society. Bentham wrote the following. He said, "The best way to be happy is to make other people happy. The best way to make other people happy is to pretend to love them. And the best way to pretend to love them is to love them in fact." So in this way, by only two moves, he erased the distance between utilitarianism and Christianity. And this is a sign of the larger concerns of these real philosophers and of their ambivalence about their own systems. Friedrich Schlegel said at the beginning of the 19th century, two things are fatal to the mind. One is to have a system, and the other is not to have one. And that is much closer to the truth in the understanding of these philosophers. So Parfit's thesis is that these three approaches to ethics are equivalent, and that from their equivalence, we are justified in inferring their truth. That is, there are three ways of climbing the same mountaintop from three different directions to reach the same summit. And the fact that we can translate them so readily into one another is an indication that what they have in common is a powerful moral truth. Now, the first thing to say is that there's some justification to this idea of their equivalence. As we will see, these views are quite indeterminate in their application. So like any good lawyer, and the philosophers now, the thought police are like lawyers, are skilled at translating one vocabulary into another and showing that they amount to the same thing. But indeterminacy is not an adequate explanation of this equivalence. In fact, these three views represent a very particular perspective on the moral life, which you could describe as a legalistic moralism that views the specification of our obligations to one another as its major work. And the fundamental interest of these three schools of the academic moral philosophy is to support our blamelessness or our innocence, not transformation or self-transformation. So they are meta-ethics concerned rather than first-order ethics that attempt to describe a particular way of conducting existence, of living. And the content of the meta-ethics is largely exhausted in the specification of a method designed to determine our obligations. So this is a very provincial view. It's, as I want to argue later, as Michael began to argue, a view characteristic of certain societies, certain parts of the world, in a certain moment in human history. And it's strange that this provincial moral perspective should then be universalized. What does this have to do with Confucius, with Zoroaster, with Christ, with the religion of the Incas and the Aztecs who tore out the hearts of their living victims at the altar? These are completely different moral views. And so if there's a dialogue in humanity about how to live, the enumeration of these three schools is very far from describing that dialogue. Nevertheless, these three views do have a significant equivalence. And they do represent a particular take on the moral life. And I now want to specify what they have in common. So it seems that they have 5 elements in common. The first element is that what they take as being the main problem in moral life is our self-centeredness. And it's not obvious that that is the main problem in moral life, because a different view, a view which I would say is central to Christianity, for example, is that the main problem in our moral life is the difficulty of reconciling ourselves to one another. It is reconciliation and not our self-centeredness which is the main problem. And we succeed, we advance, we ascend to a higher form of life by engaging one another. And the highest form of that engagement is then love, and among strangers, cooperation among free and equal individuals. Now, the second thing that these views have in common is then that in response to the problem of our self-centeredness, or selfishness, if you like, they want to assert the perspective of an impersonal benevolence and altruism. So Christ had commanded us to love the stranger, and this command seems impossible to obey. And then the moral philosophers, these moral philosophers, offer us instead the cold comfort of an impersonal and altruistic benevolence. We're just one among many. And then the question is, how should we regulate the obligations among these many? Now we come then to the third element, which is that the object is to specify our obligations to one another. And there will therefore, the moral life on this view will be a kind of book of accounts describing our liabilities and our credits. And the object is to reach the end, to come to the end of our lives, to go into the grave blameless, innocent as we can be, having acquitted ourselves of our obligations to one another, as opposed to intending some kind of transformation or self-transformation, some form of ascent. Now comes the fourth element, which is conceptually or intellectually the fundamental element in these schools of philosophy, and that is the method. The method by which we are supposed to specify our obligations to one another. And now I want to make some remarks to explain why these methods, the methods of these three schools, are so easy to manipulate, so indeterminate, and lead to certain conundrums which help account for this impression of equivalence. So the felicific calculus, the greatest happiness of the greatest number. First of all, what is the object of this? Are we to judge this act by act? That would be so-called act utilitarianism. Then, of course, the relations of cause and effect are always context specific and mutable. So there would be a constant subversion of our beliefs. So the predominant interpretation has been no, we should not judge the consequences act by act. We should judge the system of rules or institutions, the practices as a whole, rule utilitarianism as the object. Now, from what standpoint should we judge? Should we judge from the standpoint of the agent's own idea of his happiness? Then we have the problem of how these different ideas of happiness of the agents are to be aggregated. How are they to be combined? So the market would be one form of combining them. Democratic politics would be another. But every particular view of the market or of democracy is, of course, contestable. That's the subject of history, these contests over the institutional forms. Or should we say that the greatest happiness of the greatest number is not to be judged from the agent's perspective, but from the perspective of a third party, the observer, the philosopher, the deity. And then, of course, the main work in this system will have to do with the content of that conception. That's going to be what's doing the work, what's driving the result, rather than the institutional framework. Now, the Kantian view, then, the categorical imperative. The fundamental constraint is the constraint of form, a moral judgment specifying the obligations must be universalizable. Now, it seems that if we view the constraint of universality statically, it's completely indeterminate. It can't yield any result, because almost anything can be phrased in a universalistic form. The form seems impotent to deliver the content. So we have to have a dynamic view of universality. We have to say, for example, what should we want to make universal? What do we hope for in the future? And then what is the path to this higher form of being? And how can we universalize that? But if that's the case, then of course the content is not coming from the idea of universality, it's coming from this hope. And we want to know more about the hope. So it's similar to what happens in the discussion of the philosophic calculus, the greatest happiness of the greatest number. Now take the social contract view. We imagine the individuals, as in Rawls's philosophy and social contract theory, hidden behind the veil of ignorance, not knowing their own interests or their own identities, their own position in society, in an idealized circumstance of choice, deciding what the principles that specify the obligations will be. And the problem seems to be that unless we define this idealized situation of choice with sufficient restraints to give it content, it will also yield no content, just like the problem of the emptiness of the categorical imperative. It yields content only, we get out of the idealized situation of choice only what we put into it in the first place. So it's a kind of conceptual contraption, which is somehow designed to produce this miracle of producing substance out of form, and it can't really do that. So that's the problem of the methods. And you can see how they're all variations on the same theme. The theme of the inability of these conceptual contraptions to deliver what is required, which is a substantive view. The substantive view has to be somehow smuggled into them for them to produce the result that we want. Now, given all this indeterminacy, this is, as it were, the fourth element that these views have in common, we need to relate the method to an institution, to an institutional practice. So there has to be an institutional proxy for the method to operate, of the philosophic calculus, of the categorical imperative, or of the social contract. And the two great candidates to be this institutional proxy of the otherwise empty or indeterminate method are the market and democracy, two different ways of aggregating collective ideas. But as we know, the market has no natural and necessary form. There's no one way of organizing a market economy, and no self-evident way of organizing a democracy. And the contest over alternative visions of the market or of democracy is what fills up actual history. So these are the five elements that the views share in common, and they lead to this recurrent problem, which I've just described. Now, who is this for? One could ask. And I want to recall now again Schopenhauer's image of the circumstance of humanity. So, remember Schopenhauer at the beginning of The World and Its Will and Representation describes us as these porcupines in the cold night who, in order to warm one another, come closer together, they huddle together. And then they prick one another with their spines. And then they move further apart in the cold night, and then they start to get cold. So they keep getting restlessly back and forth until they settle into an uncomfortable middle distance. And this is us. This is, according to Schopenhauer's humanity. But this is also a very particular world, which is the world that the early modern Europeans imagined in the 17th and 18th century, from which these philosophers and these methods came. So I want to say something about that world in order to show how one might have these ideas, which would otherwise, to other human beings in other social circumstances, seem very strange. So first there's the idea of the private order, property and contract in the early modern European economy. So the dominant form of property is the unified absolute property right? Which is not just one right among others, it's the paradigmatic form of rights in general. The unified form of property describes a zone of absolute entitlement in which, within that zone, within the zone of ownership, you're allowed to largely disregard the interests of anyone else. That's the whole meaning of property. But if you step one little step outside of the zone, then the hammer comes down, because then the others have claims, the others have rights against you. And then the counterpart to this absolute property is the bilateral executory promise, the arm's length contract among these separate individuals, like the porcupines, who then make deals with one another. And the deal is always for an exchange of some specific performance in the future. The deal is fully bargained out and exhausted at the moment of the future performance, as opposed, for example, to the relational contract, in which the object of the contract is some continuing set of forms of cooperation, and the exchanges of the performances are only partial realizations of the purpose. The real purpose is the development of the relationship, and then there's a set of exchange, and the relational contract is typically not fully bargained out, and that's what fills a large part of social life. So it's describing this world of absolute property and of the bilateral executory promise. And what about its political form? Its political form is proto-democratic liberalism. So there's an impersonal set of political institutions which are designed to be neutral among conflicting images of the good, among all particular interests. Now we know, in fact, that no institutional order can be neutral. Every institutional order tilts the scales in favor of some forms of experience and against others. So the idea of neutrality, of this form of politics, which is a kind of perpetual motion machine, like the American Constitution, which Madison and his peers, his contemporaries, designed, is an illusion. There's no perpetual motion machine. And that was designed, in fact, to inhibit the political transformation of the social and economic order by establishing a kind of table of correspondences between the transformative ambition of any political project and the severity of the constitutional obstacles that would have to overcome in order to be implemented. So politics is cold. For example, one of the institutional characteristics of this idea of proto-democratic liberalism is that politics must be either institutional and cold, as for example in Madison's idea, or it must be hot and extra or anti-institutional, as in Caesarism. What it cannot be on this view is both hot and institutional. But it can be both hot and institutional. Alternative political institutions can differ in the extent to which they raise the level of organized popular engagement in political life. And one could say that only a high-temperature politics can in fact be a politics rich in structural content. But the most important basis of this social world is theological or religious rather than either economic or political. So this is the world of what you could describe as the middle period in the history of Protestantism. The period in which the religious sensibility was privatized, religion of the inner light, the private consciousness, not as a form of intended to penetrate all of human experience. And this is also the religion of the porcupines, of this middle distance in the cold night. That's the world. So you could say that this ethics, the academic ethics, studied now in the 21st century, was for this vanished world of early modern Europe. But maybe it would be more accurate to say, instead of saying it was a vanished world, to say it was a world that never really existed. And we can leave that question open. But then we reach this conclusion that, so who is the object? Who is the addressee of these three schools of moral philosophy? So I said, take in vain the names of those great philosophers. It's imagining this individual who stands in the front rows of the church or of the temple, raises his arms to the supreme judge, the deity, who is the fantastical embodiment of our moral severity, and says, am I not righteous and blameless? So we should judge this individual to be a monster and consign his book of accounts to the flames. That's now just continuing your argument about Parfit. But now I want to conclude then, take one more step and say, who is this human being, not this odious figure who is seeking blamelessness and innocence and to demonstrate that he has clean hands, but the real human being, the thing itself, as Shakespeare calls it, the unaccommodated, vulnerable, suffering human being in the tremulous flesh. And what are his real problems? Because we're going to be dealing with them in the course of the semester. So he has to come into the possession of life, right? He lives only once. And to live fully, he should also want to die only once. And he has to come fully into the possession of life. And life comes before goodness and before righteousness and before obligation. the possession of life. And to possess it, to build a self, and this experience of life, of self-possession, turns out to be contradictory. And now let's describe some of its contradictions. So for an individual to be free and to be able to come into the possession of life, he has to connect with other people. Because if he's unconnected, he's not free. And but then there's a contradiction. And the contradiction, which is beyond the imagination of those porcupines. The contradiction is, to be free, he has to connect, but every connection threatens him with subjugation, with loss of personal distinction. So if he's not connected, he's not free. But if he is connected, through the connection, he also loses freedom through subjugation or loss of personal distinction. So somehow, he has to be able to connect without paying for the connection the price of subjugation. And this then becomes one of the great themes of political and moral thought. How can we organize these relations so that the price that we have to pay for connection diminishes, and we can connect without losing ourselves, without being subjugated, without losing personal distinction. Now, we have an experience of that, in a personal experience, for example, in love, because love, being about reconciliation, is about this way in which we can connect without losing ourselves. But love seems not to be possible among strangers. So among strangers, there has to be a substitute for love. And the general name for the substitute of love among strangers is cooperation. And in principle, cooperation among free and equal individuals. But any particular form of such cooperation is contestable. So then we're back to the contest, the struggle, the ideological and practical struggle over how we are to organize this cooperation. And this struggle takes place in historical time. It's a political project, and political projects succeed or fail in historical time, and we don't live in historical time. We live in biographical time. So we don't get to choose our place in history, and the success or failure of these political projects is not under our control, and thus arises one of the tasks of morals of the conduct of life, which is to make up for the failures of politics. Given that the world has not been transformed in the direction that we regard as necessary, what should we do in the meantime? The conduct of life. And then there's this complicated relation between the moral and the political ideas, because the moral ideas are in some sense having to do the undone work of the political projects in the sphere of our own existence. Now, there's a second dimension, which is our relation to the social world, to the social and conceptual worlds that we build and inhabit. We are not free. We cannot come into the possession of life if we don't engage in a real world. No one is free, lost alone in the forest. We're only free engaged in a social world. But every engagement in a particular world seems to exact as the price of the engagement that we surrender to that world. And so we can only be free if we progress in addressing this second contradiction in the conditions of selfhood. We have to be able to engage, but somehow to diminish the price that we must pay for engagement, which is surrender. And the question is how we can engage without surrendering, how we can engage in such a way that in engaging we continue to resist, to transcend, to transgress, to be at the same time insiders and outsiders. Unless we can solve that problem, we are also not free. And once again, it's a problem which is both a political problem. So, if there's no neutral set of economic and political institutions, what is the alternative for this view of the neutral, impersonal order of night? What is the realistic alternative? The idea of neutrality is always adduced in support of its opposite. That is, by claiming that the institutions are neutral, we entrench them against attack, revision, and therefore become imprisoned by them. So we don't want that. And so what's the legitimate alternative to that idea? It's that the form of social life be open to a wide range of contradictory experience, and that the institutions be revisable, that we be able to amend them, to attack them, to transform them, to transcend them. So contradiction and corrigibility are the valid and legitimate counterparts to the illegitimate and false idea of neutrality. So then to the extent that we make institutions that have these results or these characteristics, we can be both insiders and outsiders. Now there's a final dimension in which to consider these contradictions of selfhood. To be free to come into the possession of life, I have to form a coherent self, a certain way of operating in the world, of being in the world. The Greeks called it a character, and they said character is destiny. So we have to have a coherent way of being in the world. We can't be just a collection of contradictory and unconnected impulses and aspirations. But a coherent form of being also can suck the life out of us. It can become the icon, the mask, which takes over the self. So we have to have this coherent way of being, but we also have to be capable of disrupting this coherent way of being. It forms a mummy around us as we grow older. And in this mummy, we begin to die by installments, little by little. And so we have to be able to break out of the mummy. And so that's a third contradiction, that we need to have the opportunity to form this coherent way of being, but at the same time to disrupt it, because otherwise we're not alive. And then we can ask of society, of culture, of education, what can it do for us to make it more likely that we will be able both to form this coherent way of being and to disrupt it? And so freedom is this combination, is this way of addressing all of these contradictions. Now, I'm saying all of that because I wanted to suggest an alternative to this idea of the Book of Accounts, because this is not about obligation. This is about freedom. It's about ascending to a higher form of life. And therefore, it's a different conception of the moral life, from the perspective of which many of our arguments here in the course will take place. So let me stop there.
Wonderful. Wonderful. Thank you so much. And let us open this up for discussion. Please, yes.
So you mentioned that one of the contradictions is that to come into possession of
Louder,
life,
please.
that to come into possession of life, we risk loss of personal distinction. But like, what about
In
that?
connecting with others.
Right. But what about that is like such a bad thing, I guess is my question.
What
Like
is what?
What is so bad about that? Of losing personal
Well, I mean, this is, so I use the idea of freedom here because I was intending to describe the initial moves in a way of thinking about the conduct of life that's not organized around the concept of obligation. So it's organized around the concept of the possession of life, vitality. Vitality comes before rightness and even before goodness. Hölderlin said, "He who thinks most deeply loves what is most alive." Vitality first. And vitality is in turn related to freedom. But it turns out that this larger idea of freedom, it's not just political freedom, it's this enhancement of life, depends on contradictory presuppositions. That was what I was trying to highlight in this last step of my remarks. So, and I described three sets of contradictions in the relation of the self to others, in the relation of the self to the world, to the social world, and in the relation of the self to itself. And so it turns out that to be free involves some progression in dealing with those contradictions. That was the argument. And the first contradiction was this contradiction that we have to connect to be free, but every connection puts us in jeopardy. So somehow we have to be able to diminish the price of the jeopardy in order to be free. Otherwise, we're not free. Yes?
I have a question. Would you mind saying more about the pursuit of freedom as a value in and of itself? I mean, because I think it goes back to maybe the ways in which out of the Enlightenment freedom has been weaponized, cynically, but also as a value, as a legitimate pursuit. It comes out of the historical context in and of itself. And I think, not to preempt discussion.
So the way I was describing it in this schematic discourse now at the end was an expansive conception of freedom related to vitality, to life, and related to the central human attribute of transcendence. So life spills over structure. And what is our essential human attribute? Yeah. We're shaped by particular social and conceptual worlds, the context, but there is always more in us than there is in them. Always more in us in each individual, but also more in us collectively, the human race. To use the theological language, they are finite in relation to us, and we are infinite in relation to them. And that's related to our idea of life, because the attributes of life are excess over structure, spontaneity, the capacity for surprise, for making the new, and all of that is by way of saying that that's a superior perspective from which to begin to think about the problem of life. Don't tell me what my obligations are before you tell me what my hopes should be and what is the direction by which I can emancipate myself. And that is a different account of the object of enlightenment and of the program of enlightenment of these same thinkers who were really interested in our empowerment and enlightenment much more than they were interested in reading to us what our obligations are, which is what these academic moral philosophers now largely do.
Please.
I think coming from an Eastern perspective, the key concept would be interconnectedness and not freedom. Is
The key
freedom
concept would be
interconnectedness and not freedom.
Interconnectedness.
interconnectedness.
So is freedom comes from a very Western way of thinking?
Well, maybe.
Related to that,
But I think less so if we relate freedom to vitality, to life, as I did. So it's true that I'm using this loaded conception of freedom that in our Western tradition is a menacing, complicated word. But I'm trying to interpret it from this perspective of the ideal of vitality and the possession of life, and the claim that vitality comes before goodness, and even before, and a fortiori, before rightness, before obligation. So that comes first. And Now, it's easy then to associate that with a purely individualist idea, but I think I just argued that it's not an individualist idea. That depends on the overcoming of all these contradictions that are implicit in this larger conception of freedom and of the possession of life. So later on in the course, toward the end, we're going to consider the contest between these two contemporary moral visions, which have different takes on this. And one of them associated historically with Confucianism, and another with these modern Western philosophers like Nietzsche and Emerson and so forth. And at least my position in those debates is that both of these modern secular ethics are defective in the form in which they come to us, and we have to reshape them. And then they become less defective, but they don't merge. They don't converge into the same view. They have similar political implications, but they deliver a different message about the conduct of life. But to the extent that they deliver a similar message, they're similar in the sense that, first of all, they're first-order ethics. They're about the conduct of life. They're not about some conceptual contraption, some method of choice. You know, this is one of the mysterious things about this academic moral philosophy. 90% of it is absorbed in a series of philosophical disputes about how you conceive of this method. But then the more refined it becomes, the more you realize that the method is really totally indeterminate for the reasons that I described, and it faces all these conundrums. So and it only works to deliver a result to the extent that you identify the method with a particular set of institutional arrangements, like democracy or the market. But then it doesn't say, it adds nothing to the conflict over the alternative forms of the market or democracy. You're left where you began. So there's a struggle to find a different starting point from the starting point of this academic moral philosophy. Yes?
So, if I understood correctly, the idea that like one of the main starting assumptions for these three schools is that the problem is self-centeredness.
Yes.
And that might be then in opposition to this idea of like the problem is not self-centeredness but reconciliation, being able to reconcile with one another. And I thought that was posited as like one is sort of like the Christian way of looking at. Where's the idea of the self-centeredness being the problem coming from?
Where does it come from? Well, I think it's this idea of the porcupines. So they're me first is so the moral philosophers tell us that's the problem. Everyone thinks me first, and we have to put them back in their place, and we have to have this impersonal perspective. So a way to explain the difference is to say just a little bit by way of anticipating our discussion of Christianity. So what's the difference between altruism and love, right? That's a way of dramatizing the answer to the question you just asked. Because, so, I said before, the perspective of Christ says, love the stranger. Then we think, we can't love the stranger. That's a command that's impossible to obey. Then the moral philosophers come, and they offer us the alternative, which I describe as cold comfort, an impersonal and altruistic benevolence. It turns out not to be the same thing. So what's the difference between love and altruism? Well, the first difference is that the problem that altruism is designed to deal with is the problem of self-advancement or preferring oneself to the others, as opposed to altruism, as opposed to love. And the perspective of altruism is like the doctrine of good faith in classical private law. Good faith means acting in such a way that you give equal weight to the interests of the other person. You don't consider the interests of the other, the party with whom you're contracting, for example, in these arm's length deals, as having a lower weight to your own interests. So that's altruism. And in love, the problem is, how can I accept this other person in such a way that my connection to the other is not subtracting from me, that it's adding to me? That's a different problem. A second contrast between altruism and love is that love, unlike altruism, has an epistemic or imaginative threshold. So the initial problem in love is the ability to imagine the other. There's no such problem in altruism. In altruism, you make sacrifices for the sake of the other from a distance or even from on high. And the sacrifices may involve even the sacrifice of your own life. But it's from this distance. In love, there's a threshold difficulty of it can't advance unless you're able to imagine the other. And of course, the imagination can be distorted, as in romanticism, in which the other becomes just a projection. And you're not in love with the other, you're in love with love, or you're really in love with yourself or with something else. And then third, love involves necessarily a heightened vulnerability. So in altruism, you make a gift. The gift may require sacrifices, I just said, but there's no inner jeopardy. The altruistic donor is not in jeopardy internally or emotionally. Love implies or exacts a heightening of vulnerability. So it's a different experience. It's about something else. It's about the problem of reconciliation and not about the problem of constraints on selfishness. That's a different starting point for the moral life. Now we can all agree love is not a solution for life among strangers. And then we ask, well, what would then be a solution? And then comes this idea that it's cooperation. And what are the attributes, what are the higher forms of cooperation, and what attributes should they have? Given that there's no natural form of democracy and no natural form of the market.
Please.
Hi. With regards to earlier you were mentioning like the political form that some of these might take, some of these bodies of thought or preconceptual philosophies might take place in, and you mentioned the severity of constitutional obstacles and how that can be something that we imprison ourselves.
I'm giving the example of the American constitutional right. A typical, I would say, an extreme form of proto-democratic liberalism, yes.
Yes, and so with regards to that as a critique, would you say, is that critique trying to strive for the goal of maybe like what would be the alternative per se in that critique? Like,
Well,
would it be like a Posemarian legal realist that you still have a constitution, but you know you just constantly are?
no, I mean, but this is not the object of this course, right? Because I would defend a different direction for the organization of democracy, a high-energy democracy. I don't believe that, first of all, I don't believe that democratic politics has to be either cold and institutional or hot and anti-institutional. I don't believe that we have to choose between Madison and Mussolini. I believe that we can have a politics that is both hot and institutional, and that raises the level of organized political popular engagement in political life. It depends on a series of very concrete things. The relation of politics to the media, to money, the electoral regimes, whether the vote is optional or mandatory, and so forth. Then second, there's the question of the setup of the government, the democratic state. So the Americans in their constitution have these two architectural principles. there's this a liberal principle of fragmenting power. There are many different branches, there are many sources of power in the state. And they have a conservative principle of the slowing down of politics through Madison's scheme of checks and balances. So under the Madisonian constitutional design, the purpose is to perpetuate impasse. It's not an involuntary consequence. It's by design. It's by intention. It's regarded as making politics safer for economic and social freedom, the preservation of the market order, inhibiting political attack on the arrangements of society and of the private economy. And I think, and the Americans think, they revere their Constitution, the founders of their Constitution, they're secular saints. Even though one of these saints, Thomas Jefferson, proposed that the Constitution should be trashed every 2.5 generations so that the dead wouldn't be allowed to rule the living. They don't think so. And so they think that these two principles, the liberal principle and the conservative principle, are naturally and necessarily conjoined. That's false. They're conjoined by intention, because it's very easy to imagine constitutional arrangements that preserve the liberal principle but reject the conservative one. For example, by saying that either of the political branches, in the face of a deadlock, of an impasse between the political branches, can call early elections, but the early elections will always be bilateral for both branches. And then third, there's federalism. And in the Federalist Papers, the states are supposed to be laboratories of experimentation. But in classical federalism, with its rigid allocation of powers among the federation, the states can't be laboratories of experimentation. So there should be strong central initiative, but under certain conditions that prevent abuse, parts of the country should be able to diverge from the dominant solutions in the country as a whole and to create counter models of the national future. And then you have a dialectic, the main road and the alternatives to it, energizing democratic. So those are examples of the institutional arrangements by which would change the character of political life. Then it's not politics for the porcupines, it's for these energized citizens. So that's a political project. Now that's not the subject of this course, because here we're dealing with the next steps on the moral or personalist side of the project of world revolution, and not with the next steps politically and economically. But of course everything is related. So I just said one of the ways of understanding moral ideas is that we have moral ideas to make up for the failures of politics. St. Augustine tells us that every age is equidistant from eternity, but we don't get to choose our position in history. So we're stuck with a period. So I was born in a counter-revolutionary interlude in this long revolutionary period in the history of humanity. I don't want my ideas and my actions to be shaped by the biases of this counter-revolutionary interlude. So I have to take matters into my own hands and act in a different direction. Yes?
So I wanted to parse through the first contradiction of when it comes to coming into a life of self-possession, and that is connection with others.
Yes.
So my understanding is to exist means to be perceived, and if you are being perceived by others, so there's this underlying, undergirding ideology that it is a very transactionally perception, so either you can benefit the person or the other person's benefit is of benefit to you. How does that then come into play when you want to have connections with others without having any infringement on?
No, but it's not a zero-sum idea, if that's what you mean. I mean, like, what's the? I mean, take for example the market order. So what's one simple definition of what a market is? So a market is a form of simplified cooperation among strangers that is unnecessary when there is high trust, and impossible when there is no trust. So the market order, as we conceive it, on the basis of this early modern European idea, organized around absolute property and arm's length, bilateral contracts and so forth, is dependent, one of its premises is the generalization of a low level of trust among strangers. So other societies in the past had radical distinctions between how you treat the stranger and how you treat the insiders in your kinship group, in your religion, or so. Everything to the insiders, nothing for the strangers. The market requires the generalization of a low level of trust among everyone, among strangers. But that's only one kind of market. So the knowledge economy, the new form of productive innovation that we have now in the world, has as one of its moral presuppositions less hierarchy, more cooperation, cooperative competition as we call it, and an elevation of the level of discretionary initiative and reciprocal trust that is allowed and required of all participants in the process of production. So that results in a different kind of market, and with different institutions and different legal practices, dependent, among other things, on a different moral presupposition. So it will be a heightening of the level of trust, and that will be a different kind of market. So again, there'll be this interaction between our political or economic ideas and our moral ideas. And so this notion that we have low trust and we owe things and we're distant from each other, that's one form of social life. But that's not the only form of social life. And I'm disputing it here as a starting point for ethical thinking.
Please.
With regards to, kind of piggybacking off the point that we're speaking of how in order to be free, we have to interact with the social world and engage with others. In order to be free or interact, we have to interact with the social world because we can't just be free alone in the forest. Would that be something?
But more specifically, what I said, and this is the sense of these categories that I described, it's after all just another intellectual strategy. It's not absolute, but it's to say, we are free only to the extent that we solve each of those contradictions. So it's not that we either solve them or don't solve them, but we solve them more or less. And the more we solve them, the more we can progress in solving them, the freer we are and the more lifelike. So what is the objective now, rephrased in theological language? The objective is to become more human by becoming more godlike. Not by increasing our share in the divine attributes of omnipotence and omniscience, but by increasing our share in the divine attribute of transcendence. So we participate in a particular world, but we transcend it. So then one of the things that we require of our institutions is that they be revisable, that we be able to challenge them, that we be able to correct them in the light of experience.
So I'm kind of more into a little bit of a different route. I agree with you, and I just was wondering if, would you say, or I don't know if this is a better question to ask you with regards to, would like the Buddhist, because obviously the paradigmatic, like Buddha went into the forest and became
Yes.
free by losing his ego, and so would that be counteropposed when you're obviously we're not talking about Buddhists.
Well, that's another approach to life, and we're going to discuss it. It's actually one of the options that before we come to the contest of those two modern secular ethics, we're going to discuss certain wider options in the moral history of humanity. One of them will be exemplified by Buddhism, and another by Christianity. So, and then we can have an argument about that. But what a defender of the idea of vitality, like me, would say is that the solution, which on some accounts Buddhism presents to the sufferings of life is to die beforehand. So, I don't want that. So, more life, not less life. Yes.
I know that was like a glib, short summation of Buddhism, but to die.
It wasn't meant to be a summation of Buddhism. It was meant to be, of course, an incendiary critical statement.
Just that, like, the Buddha didn't have to kill an ego. He had to realize that there was no self to begin with. He's just realizing something that was already true, as opposed to destroying something that is bad.
No, of course, but to be fair, there are like two families of conceptions of happiness. We can relate this to the problem of eudaimonism, of the idea of happiness in the world history of philosophy. So there's one family of views in which the source of happiness is the negation of suffering, of unrest, of restlessness. And there's another family of views in which happiness is the development of life, this flourishing of a form of life, which, because it is necessarily contradictory, involves suffering. And that's a different view. So is the objective, so Schopenhauer believed that life was suffering, and the aim is to overcome suffering, and therefore the will to live, to overcome the will to live, to overcome the will in general, and to have the willness attitude to reality. And this is all, of course, all of this, both the affirmation of it and the negation of it, are way outside the school of philosophy. They're not discussing this in the school of philosophy. Yes.
I know we've already clarified that when we say the school of philosophy, we mean a subdivision within a subdivision within a subdivision of the school of philosophy.
No, we mean.
I just wanted to defend Western philosophy a little bit against.
I'm not. I would be the last person that you would attack Western philosophy for. That's all I care about. So it's not the subdivision of the subdivision. It's the conventional form now in the academy, in the Anglo-American Academy, of the study of moral philosophy. The whole university culture in every sphere is based on the marriage of method to subject matter. And so there's this idea that there's a natural method for every subject matter. So when they have these core curriculums, general education and so forth, it's all about that. So the human mind is an organum of different forms of inquiry. Each form of inquiry is exemplified by a particular discipline, and the nature of the discipline is illustrated by the way in which the Harvard professors teach it. So evolutionary biology is taught by a historical method. Fundamental physics is taught by an anti-historical method. Economics is not the study of the economy, to everyone's surprise. For example, Max Weber's studies of the economy is not economics. Economics is the study of a method developed by the marginalist theoreticians at the end of the 19th century. That's the whole university system. And the national curriculums that exist in the world are just a kind of infantilization of the orthodoxies of the university culture. They're designed to induce the young to mistake the dominant ideas for the way things are. So they're an emasculation, delivering the young to the universities prepared for a life of intellectual servility. So what do we want as Democrats and experimentalists? We want to immunize the young against this. So when they show up at the door of the university, they will not be susceptible to this kind of indoctrination. Yes?
I just have to say, having done an undergrad in philosophy and now doing a master's in theology, I just don't think that that's what's happening in philosophy departments at all. Like, all the critiques you're making are critiques that we made in those classes.
Yes, of course.
Like,
Of course.
no one really is
course, of course. But I was making a more general point about the way in which the university is organized, and it's organized by these forced marriages of methods to subject matter. And the first act of intellectual liberation is to demand divorce, to divorce the method from the subject matter, to say the subject matter can be studied by a completely different method. And to do that, we have to go back to fundamental education and the education of the young, one of the attributes of which should be that every subject be taught at least twice. Nothing should be taught once. Everything should be taught from contrasting points of view. And if that were the way, then people would be resistant from the beginning, right, Michael? They would come to the university prepared to subvert. And not to listen and to obey. Aren't we up to your time now?
I think we are. So thank you for a very robust discussion. And next week we will throw ourselves into Christianity to ask, have we built upon the most exciting parts of the tradition? If not, what would it mean to do so? And concretely, how would we go about doing so? And how would that bring to the fore the very issues that we at least fear perhaps are being left out of a discussion by partner? Thank you so much and see you next week.
I think you went
Oh, total pleasure. Absolutely, yes, total pleasure. Oh, yes. What we can do is we can add you to the website, which means that access to all the meetings, and if you can't make track of it,
it's really sad.
just drop me an email. Absolutely. Fantastic.
All last semester I was like, I never broke. Well, I married a couple days ago. I never lost a habit.
Yes,
Right.
Oh yeah.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. I think actually, up to you entirely. So, from the business school, does it matter if she goes through HBS, HMS? I don't think it
I
does.
prefer you cross-register for the law school,
Okay.
because then I may able to control a local bureaucrat. More than I can control his business. Because my world.
That's what I was thinking. Like, I noticed you've got.
Fantastic. Great to see you. Thank you so much. So basically, yeah, the goal of the class is precisely that. It's to give you a sense of what the range of possibilities are. So how different traditions of philosophy and religion dealt with these issues. How to live, yeah, exactly.
also how to think of relationships.
Yep, yep.
Broader systems.
Yep,
Cool.
precisely.
Great.
Fantastic.
Thank you so much.
Great. See you soon. Thank you. Hey, how's it going?
Good. I'm Archie.
Yes, Archie,
Yes.
great to meet you. Yes. Yes.
Thank you for both classes. They've been really fantastic.
Total pleasure. Thank you for your involvement in them.
Yeah, of course. I guess I won't continue to defend the anime tradition all the way through the
Oh,
class.
no, you feel free to. Please.
Yeah.
Of course. Absolutely.
Yeah. What is your field? Like your close to East Asian? Or no?
Yeah, although I keep my PA is actually in philosophy. So yes, so yes, I fully agree with you about the power of the Western tradition. And thereafter, I switched to doing teaching tools. I'm very invested in comparative logic.
Right. Good. Yeah. I'm now in the South Asian tradition learning science.
Fantastic. Wonderful.
Indian
Fantastic.
Yeah.
No, please continue on. Please. Absolutely.
Cool. Thanks very much.
Fantastic.
See you next
Very
week.
soon. Yes.
Hi, Professor.
Hey, how's it going?
My name's Thomas.
Thomas, great to meet you.
You too. You lectured in Theories and Methods
Oh,
at the
yes,
school,
yes,
and I love you. I love your work. I've never heard of Professor Unger. He's lovely too, but I really wanted to learn from you in this class, and so
Thank
far,
you so much.
so far, I've just loved it.
Oh, thank you so much.
Yeah.
Thank you for being a part of it.
No, thanks for what you're doing. So can I bookmark a question that I mean, you two are like really tracing a broad arc, and I'm sitting back and like enjoying the pacing, and it's like they'll get to it. But I will say, like, in the capacity of I've worked as a Buddhist teacher for.
Fantastic.
I was doing that for about 12 years before I came to HDS.
Wonderful.
Which is why I'm so interested in learning. Like, I look at you as just a top tier sinologist, but.
Definitely not, but that's
But one thing I wanted to say, because the reason I mentioned that is that when you talked about the domestication of, well, like in this class, the domestication of the radicality of the Emersons and so forth, and then in the past class talking about the Buddha and Buddhism and domesticated mindfulness,
definitely.